Welcome back, class, to this lecture today, or now we're going to be talking about Philippians, Paul's letter to the Philippians. I do want to remind you to do all the readings. Bart Ehrman, the Introduction to the New Testament, the sections from my book, all those are really important to keep in mind, specifically in the way we think about Paul, who Paul was and is, and what his ministry is about. So make sure you keep those readings going, and also read the letters for the week. Read 1 Thessalonians, read Philippians, read Philemon. This might be the easiest week in this whole semester to read all the books for the week because those letters are so short. So let's jump into Paul's letter to the Philippians. First of all, Philippi, the city of Philippi, was very similar to all the cities that Paul had visited already. First in Thessalonica, Corinth, these cities were large cities, major trade routes. But Philippi in particular was just northeast of Thessalonica. It was on the Ignatian Way, this major trade route that connected Rome in the west to Persia in the east. Major trade route there. Because of Roman innovation, those roads were paved. That was a major technology during this time period, which made travel much more accessible through all four seasons. So whereas before it would get real muddy and it was hard to make it on those roads, with the invention of paved roads, Romans made that possible. So Philippi is a major city in Rome. It's a trade route on the ground east-west, but it's also a port city, and that port is also very important through the Mediterranean world. So Paul looks like he went to Philippi, like he went to Thessalonica, like he went to Corinth, and set up shop and started a church there. Now the thing is, we don't know very much about the church at Philippi. It was it's mentioned in Acts, where Acts talks about Lydia, this woman who dealt with cloth, and there Acts also talks about the Philippian jailer. Those are important characters to the book of Acts. But Paul never mentions them. We have no record from Paul himself about those characters. So what we have from Paul is only this letter. So that's it's a small letter. It doesn't have a ton of material in it, so we don't know much about Paul and his work there at Philippi. But in 1 Thessalonians, Paul tells us that he was shamefully treated in Philippi. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. So it's worth going back to read that. So we know that he had some troubles in Philippi. We don't know what the nature of those troubles were. But when he writes his letter to the Philippians, he is in jail. Now, we don't know where he's in jail. He's not in Philippi when he writes this letter, but he's certainly imprisoned, and he says it's because of the gospel. So we don't know if he had gotten in trouble in another place by his apostolic mission, but he certainly considers himself in prison because of his ministry. So he's writing from a troubled place because he's writing from jail. And he's writing to a church in Philippi where he had been confronted or badly treated. And we don't know if this is badly treated within the congregation or within the city, but he wasn't treated well based on what he says in 1 Thessalonians. But Paul seemingly followed his pattern of ministry in Philippi just as he did in Thessalonica, just as he did in Corinth, which was specifically targeted toward Gentiles. Again, we think that Paul came to the city, started a business, lived very close, if not in the same facility as the business, probably worked with leather goods, and there interacted with non-Jews, Gentiles in particular. And that's where he was trying to convert them. And Philippians does contain kind of the basics of Paul's gospel. Paul was trying to win Gentiles and convert them to the one God of Israel. And after that acceptance of the one God of Israel, it was conviction that Jesus Christ was the Son of God and that Jesus would return at the end of time in judgment. This is found throughout the letter of Philippians in chapter 1, verse 6 and verses 10 and 11, chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, and chapter 3, verses 20 through 21. That message is consistent through Philippians and also consistent in what we find in Paul's other letters. So that's kind of our conception of how Paul started the church in Philippi, some of the events surrounding that, and some of the impetus behind the letter. So let's talk about the letter to the Philippians in particular. Like 2 Corinthians, most scholars believe that we at least have two letters in this short letter to the Philippians. So we have two letters in one. And we believe this mainly because out of these four chapters, Philippians chapter 1 and 2 is just really different than chapter 3 and 4. And there's a abrupt shift in tone and content. So the first two chapters of Philippians are very friendly. And I'll say, and I've got to confess here, Philippians is one of my favorite letters that Paul writes because it's quotable from chapter 1 to chapter 4. Some of our favorite Bible verses come out of this letter, whether it's the Christ hymn in chapter 2, let this mind be in you that was also in Christ, or chapter 4 about running the race. And it's just full of really amazing passages, both the friendly letter of chapter 1 and 2 and the letter of warning in chapter 3 and 4. But there's a lot there. So the first part of this letter, chapters 1 and 2, is a friendly letter, very similar to 1 Thessalonians, very kind, very positive tone. And the purpose of that letter is pretty clear in chapter 2, verses 25 through 30. Paul basically says, this is why I'm writing this letter to you. I'm actually going to read that to you. Not that you need it because you've probably already read it on your own. But this is what Paul says. Chapter 2, verse 25. Still, I think it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and co-worker in the fellowship and fellow soldier, your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for all of you and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. He was indeed so ill that he nearly died. But God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, so that I would not have one sorrow after another. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, in order that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. Welcome him then in the Lord with all joy and honor such people, because he came closest to death for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for those services that you could not give me. So there we hear the reason why Paul wrote chapters 1 and 2. He's responding to the church at Philippi because they heard that Epaphroditus was sick and they were really concerned for him. So Paul writes this letter in response to their fear about Epaphroditus. And it's a good letter. He's saying that Epaphroditus is okay and he's going to be okay, and that when their anxiety about Epaphroditus' illness is quenched and they feel like he's okay, Paul will feel better about it as well. So the whole reason why Paul writes Philippians chapters 1 and 2 is to respond to their concern for Epaphroditus' health. And we know, based on 1 Thessalonians, that issues of death were serious business, because a lot of the theology that we have now, they were in the process of creating that. So the idea that Christ's second coming was imminent, and Paul felt like it was going to happen in his own lifetime, and he preached that that really did give people serious questions about what happened when people died before Jesus came back. That's the nature of 1 Thessalonians. But you can imagine that that's the same kind of fear that the Christians or the Jesus followers in Philippi had when they heard that Epaphroditus, who was one of their best, right, maybe a major leader in the church, when he was ill, what's going to happen to him? So Paul writes a letter that says he's totally fine. Now, when we get to chapter 3, this is where the whole letter shifts. Chapter 3, verse 1 is actually broken in half, and it looks like the first part of chapter 3, verse 1, Paul's kind of concluding his letter. So chapter 3, verse 1 says, "Finally, brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord." So the finally, it looks like this is the end of his letter. And then the second part of chapter 3, verse 1, he goes, "To write the same things to you is not troubling to me, and for you it is a safeguard." Now, that's a real big shift to finally, brothers, rejoice in the Lord, period. Now, to write to you the same things is not troublesome to me, for it's your safeguard. So it looks like there's a total shift, and this is probably another letter that Paul wrote and not a continuation of the same letter. Mainly because after he writes this, the tone immediately shifts. Chapter 3, verse 2, "Beware of the dogs, beware of the evil workers, beware of those who mutilate the flesh." So it's a real dramatic shift in tone and emphasis and content, really. Paul immediately begins to attack opponents, and he calls them dogs. That is pretty intense language, and was absolutely as mean as it sounds. These were opponents that, again, look like people who are arguing that the Gentiles, the believers of Jesus in Philippi, had to be circumcised and had to follow Jewish laws and customs. So it seems like this comes up over and over again with Paul's letters, that he is challenged at every place by Jewish believers in Jesus that are saying that if you are Gentile and you want to become a Jesus follower, that means you have to become Jewish. And so Paul is again resisting this common thread of challenge that he receives all over the place in the churches in Galilee, which are not far. If you go from the Ignatian Way from Philippi and go east, you'll run into Galatia in Asia Minor. So again, there's this segment of early Judaism, that the early Jesus movement, that's very Jewish. It was a Jewish movement. And Paul is the one who's doing something innovative. Paul is the one who's changing tradition, really, and doing something that many would believe is non-biblical by letting Gentiles into the covenant without becoming Jewish, without circumcision and other things of that nature. So Paul in chapter 3 really kind of addresses this. This is where we also get a big autobiographical section about Paul, where he talks about himself. And now some of you had questions about whether Paul was Jewish or Gentile. Read chapter 3 of Philippians. This is where Paul's almost bragging about being a Jew and what kind of Jew he is. He's a very law-observant Jew that was trained in the law and highly educated in the law, and became even so Jewish, in fact, that he was a Pharisee. So I don't think Paul would make those boasts if he wasn't Jewish. So this is some clear evidence that Paul certainly was Jewish and was arguing against his other Jews who were all believers in Jesus. Specifically about how to incorporate Gentiles. So this is an issue in the letter. He also in chapter 4 it looks like he's addressing another problem in Philippi, and it was a dispute between two women, Euodia and Syntyche. It looks like they were two strong leaders in that church. Paul actually calls them co-workers. He says in chapter 4, verse 2, I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you also, my loyal companion, help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. So these two women are not just instrumental in the church at Philippi. Paul calls them co-workers, co-laborers. So they are instrumental in Paul's own life and Paul's own journey in ministry. So it looks like there may have been a dispute between them, and that being it's such major figures in that church, it may have caused some divisions within the church. So Paul addresses those kind of issues as well in chapters 3 and 4. So chapters 3 and 4 seem to be a letter of warning. Chapters 1 and 2 look like a friendship letter. And so it kind of begs the question of like, when did he write these two letters? And this is just trying to get understand this correspondence with the church at Philippi, because the letter itself is so kind of abruptly shifts in that section, just like Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapter 10 through 13. So how does this timeline look? All right. So it looks like Paul went to Philippi and started a church there in the same pattern of ministry that he had in the past. And then he left and went to another city. It doesn't look like he was in Philippi long. I mean, we don't know that for sure, but it doesn't seem like he was there long. And when he was in another place, it looks like Paul was in prison. He wrote from prison, and the Philippians heard about that. And so they sent Epaphroditus with an offering to take care of Paul. And this is that really nice part that Paul kind of responds to. So they take care of his needs. They send him some money with Epaphroditus. And Epaphroditus then tells Paul that there are some false teachers who believe that are preaching this gospel of circumcision, and that Euodia and Syntyche are arguing with each other, and there's a rift. So in response to that, Paul writes this letter of warning, probably the first letter he writes, and sends that to the church at Philippi. We don't know if they ever responded to that. All we know is that in the process, when he sent that letter, Epaphroditus got really sick and almost died. And somehow the church at Philippi heard about that and responded. And so Paul then writes Philippians chapter 1 through 2 to say, thank you, he's okay now, all is well, and he's going to be delivering this letter back to you. So that's how, that's the way scholars think about the correspondence between Paul and the Christians there at Philippi. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture. Please read through the letter to the Philippians. It is 4 chapters long. It's very short. Read Ehrman's work on Philippians in your required reading. And also pay real close attention to my work about constructing Paul. If you have any questions, any comments, again, feel free to send me an email.